My name was Maya Bennett, and for as long as I could remember, my hands had been full of other people's celebrations. I could fold napkins into airplanes with my eyes closed, list caterers by the sparkle of their plating photos, and assemble a playlist that made even the shyest ant dance. I could budget in my sleep. Line items for floral foam, an extra $50 for unexpected corkage, a contingency in case the marquee letter E fell over and crushed someone's ego. People told me I was organized. They said I had a knack. They meant, you will always do it, because you do not ask for help and you rarely ask for yourself. The house had smelled like rosemary and lemon that evening, the way it always did when my mother, Susan Hollis, decided that the living room needed to feel fresh. The Hollis family was doing what it did best, making a normal Tuesday into a strategic meeting about someone else's vanity. The dining table was covered in glossy brochures, fabric swatches pinned to the edge like small decisive flags. A laptop with half a dozen tabs open to venue pages and cake designs. My father, David, breathed into his mug of black coffee with the kind of grandiosity that implied the world had paused to admire his taste. He had a way of pressing his palms together as if he were showing off a rare coin. It was a gesture that always meant someone else would be doing the work. Ava's brand launch is going to put us on the map, my mother said, voice a little too high. The vowel of each word stretched like taffy. She traced a glossy invite with a manicured finger. I want it editorial. I want that wow factor. Maya, I know you'll make it perfect. They slid a manila folder toward me the way you pass a baton. Inside were printed mood boards, marble countertops, mannequins in satin, a champagne tower that looked like a beaded chandelier. There were budgets with numbers circled in red. There was a card with the words vendor contacts, Maya, hammered at the top in bold, as if the paper itself were pleading. You're so organized, baby. You'll do this better than any agency, David said, smiling in the way that suggested he had rehearsed that line the way men rehearse sports metaphors. I smiled back because that was the reflex, like breathing. I opened the folder, smoothing the glossy pages as if they were fragile birds. My fingers lingered over Ava's name in script. Ava Hollis. Launch. It felt personal and not personal at all. Ava, at 22, had a following that made hotels ask for her rate card. She was the sort of person who could phone a photographer and book a rooftop at dusk. She had the kind of smile that translated into engagement metrics. I could have, in that moment, said no. I could have set the folder down and closed the door and made myself disappear like ash in snow. But I had spent my whole life learning how to make other people's suns rise. If someone needed directions, I would map them. If a table needed a centerpiece, I would glue the peonies until my fingers ached. Saying no would feel like turning my tools into a grave. I thought about my own birthdays, patchwork of postponements and we'll do it next weeks that never came. I thought of the 25th birthday I had spent rewiring a playlist for my cousin's graduation. I remembered a 31st I had been promised in the spring, a small dinner that dissolved into, we'll do brunch, and then brunch became nothing at all. I remembered the year I'd asked for lavender soap and gotten a voucher for bed sheets because you always do the practical thing, Maya. Practical, responsible, invisible. I left that night with the folder under my arm and a heaviness in my chest that felt like a stone in a pocket. At my apartment, the city lights spilled on the hardwood like confetti. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen counter. The folder opened in front of me like a plea. The budget line items were neat, the caterer's quote reasonable, the deposit schedule brutal. They wanted a deposit up front. They wanted me to front the money and they'd reimburse me. It read like the same script I'd followed for years. You do the work, and someday they will remember to say thank you. I logged into my bank account because habit was cruelty. I scrolled through a ledger of small adult costs. Rent, student loans with gnawed edges, a new laptop installment that had been deferred twice. There was a balance that made my throat constrict. If I paid the deposit with my card, I would be letting them spend my money on a spectacle for someone who shone brighter in their social feeds than I ever did in their eyes. I remembered the time I had canceled a trip with my college roommate to design a retirement slideshow for my aunt. I remembered folding 50 napkins into little hearts until my knuckles swelled with white. I remembered the way my birthday presents had been replaced with an offhand line, "We'll celebrate next week." Next week became a ghost of a plan. I laughed at myself then, a small, bitter sound, the kind that tastes like copper. This is ridiculous, I told the empty kitchen. A sentence under my breath started to grow like a seed pushing through asphalt. What if I didn't do it this time? The thought was ridiculous, and then it was intoxicating. It was as if I had discovered a secret door in a house I'd been dusting all my life. I booked a flight. Not a long, languid browse where indecision ate away at price differences. I found one. Sedona, 3 nights, a small spa resort perched on red rock cliffs, sunrise yoga, the kind of place that smelled of sage and cardamom and newness. And I clicked. The confirmation pinged like a bell. I booked a room with a balcony that allowed you to drink coffee and feel the stones look back at you. I called my best friend, Jess, and told her in the clipped sentences of someone who was half laughing, half confessing to a crime. "You're serious," she said. Jess had known me since we were 20, since the global systems class where she had cried over an algorithm and I'd given her a napkin and a plan. She was a nurse now, steady hands, wide, brassy laugh, and she had a way of making my worst ideas feel like they're a good idea if they were wrapped in a reality check. "I booked Sedona," I said, "for my birthday." "Are you out of your mind?" she asked, then softened. "No. God, Maya, yes. Do you need me to book a ticket?" "You in?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jess had been the one to hold my hand through breakups, to sit on my balcony with wine and say, "This is for you." She was my witness. "I'm in," she said. "Send me the details. I'll bring a banner and a cake if you want." "I want everything I've never had," I said, hearing how childish it sounded. But when Jess laughed, a full, delighted peal, that sound was more delicious than any compliment from my parents. It felt like an incantation. I created a folder on my laptop titled My Birthday. It was small, stubborn, and so ridiculously defiant that it made me smile. I saved images: a sunrise over red rocks, a photo of a small wooden table with teacups, a journal with a leather strap. I made a list: sleep, silence, a massage, one real wish. I wrote the word Maya in the first file, like a label on a package I had hidden somewhere between being useful and being seen. The next week was theater. I went to work at the SaaS company where I coordinated product rollouts and stakeholder meetings. I was good at translating chaos into timelines. My colleagues noticed that my phone kept buzzing. "You okay?" my manager, Mark, asked. He had keys to my calendar the way some people had keys to a gym locker, raid-ready and practical. "It's family," I said. "They need the launch done right." "You always do," he said, with a kind of fatigue that suggested he trusted my competence and didn't want to pry into the bruise beneath it. Later, he pulled me aside and offered an extra day of comp time. "Take it," he said. "You need it." I folded documents, replied to emails, set deadlines. My mother called 3 times a day with vendor updates, each call stitched with praise and invisible strings. "You're the only one who can pull this off," she said into the phone like a talisman. I answered with the same soft voice that had never learned to say no. But while I typed budgets and matched napkin colors in my head, Jess and my friend group were lighting the map of my rebellion. There was Lila, the woman from my book club who talked like an investment banker but baked like a saint. There was Marcus, my neighbor who offered to take my plants while I was gone, and Tomoko, a former colleague who insisted on buying a private session with a local masseuse as a gift. I pretended to work for my family. I filled in spreadsheets with fake confirmations, sent templated emails to imaginary vendors, pretended to secure deposits with a flourish. I took the $2,000 deposit. My mother slid me with a smile and a look that said, "You're our girl," and I put it into my savings account. I told myself aloud that this was compensation for years of unpaid labor. The transfer showed up in my bank feed, transfer from Susan Hollis. It shimmered on the screen like a small crooked victory. The decision felt like theft and honesty all at once. I had helped them build a life of appearances. Now I was borrowing a page from that life to write one for myself. The day before Ava's launch, I packed my bag in a silence so loud it hurt. I folded a sweater the way my mother had folded linens, neat and precise. I wrapped my passport in the pages of a small notebook, where I had written lists of things I wanted to do if I ever put myself first. The list had childish things: go on a silent hike, meditate at sunrise, and adult ones, see a therapist in a consistent way, open a retirement account that wasn't just a spreadsheet full of hopeful numbers. I packed a dress that I had never worn because it felt too special, as if I had been reserving beauty for a future I wasn't sure I would get to have. I set my phone to an away message. Out of office, returning Monday. I switched my status to Do Not Disturb. It felt like climbing a ladder out of a well. We left at dawn. Jess drove, the city falling away in the rear view like the edge of an old life. The sun rose molten over a highway that smelled faintly of dust and sun-warmed leather. For the first time in years, I didn't check my messages. I let the road be my screen. The red rocks of Sedona slowly resolving on the horizon in a blaze of orange. When we arrived, Sedona was everything the pictures had promised and more. The air smelled of juniper and hot stones. It had the kind of clarity that made tiny daily anxieties look like cobwebs. The hotel was a low-slung building of wood and glass. The concierge led us to our room, where a balcony framed the red cliffs like a portrait. Jess opened a window and the light poured in, sharp and candid. I thought of all the rooms in the Hollis house where my presence had always been assumed but rarely requested. Rooms filled with the smell of coffee and the echo of someone else's laughter. We went down to a small, sunlit courtyard where my friends had assembled. Jess grinned, like she was about to steal the moon, and waved a handmade banner. Happy birthday, Maya. The letters were crooked in the best possible way. Lila held a small cake with a single candle sticking out of it like a flag. Tomoko handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note. For the girl who organizes everything, here's an organizer for her own life. It was a journal with a leather strap, blank as a new map. I cried, because joy sometimes comes as a soft invasion. Tears slid warm down my face, and I laughed because it felt absurdly extravagant to have people sing my name at full volume. My name sounded like a revelation when they said it, not a task list, not a role, just the word itself. That night, as we sat under a sky so wide the stars felt like a promise, I felt a kind of permission I hadn't negotiated for. I watched the flame of the candle shake in the desert wind and made a wish that was indecently simple, that I would no longer be a spare tire in other people's lives. While I was in Sedona, the house in the suburbs fell into chaos. My mother had assumed I was on schedule, that I was bowing to the ritual of being the family's logistics engine. David had been smug enough to assume I would handle a crisis. Ava, meanwhile, was preening in the belief that her launch was immaculate, a family-created coronation. Guests had been sent invites. A venue had been booked in the name of confidence, a caterer called. But the deposits, well, they had been miscalculated because the person who had been trusted to make them had been sitting on a balcony 200 miles away, listening to crickets and tasting sage. The venue called. There was no deposit. The caterer did not arrive. The marquee letters were scheduled for setup, but the company had no confirmation number. Guests stood outside an empty room, baffled. A PR influencer stormed with glossy indignation. Ava, the beloved, called my phone the way someone calls a lifeline when they can't see the rope. I silenced my phone. It felt like a small, deliberate violence, but it was also a mercy. For 3 days, I remained quiet. Jess screened the calls, letting my mother leave voicemails that sounded like wounded eagles, accusations softened into pleading. When I finally listened, there were 77 missed calls and a string of messages that climbed from hurt to anger like a fast escalator. You did this, my mother said in one of her voicemails, voice splintered. You ruined Ava's launch. How could you? Her words were surgical. They were not addressed to me as a person, but as a function. For the first time, something inside of me did not try to mend. I colored them with a truth they couldn't fit. You have used me. For years. In Sedona, I sat on a rooftop and watched the sunrise like it was the first page of my life. It glittered, slow and patient. I had a massage that felt like a reset button on my spine. I drank bitter coffee and ate fruit that tasted like sugar and light. I walked among the red rocks and felt my breath come in longer, kinder measures, like someone had widened my lungs. We returned home 2 days after the would-be launch. The house was thick with rage. My phone buzzed in the glove compartment as if it were a trapped insect. Messages poured like rain. My mother sent long texts with exclamation marks and capital letters and then a short one. We need to talk. They came to my apartment. They arrived like a deputation. David stern, Susan with a kind of wounded dignity, Ava in a dress that had clearly been for a different stage singularity. They stood on my small living room rug as if it were neutral ground. You can't just leave, my mother said before I could. Her voice went high at the end, a tiny violin. There were deposits. There was a schedule. People were there. I know, I said, My voice sounded thin even to me. I know. What did you expect? Ava said, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and entitlement. You can't just disappear. This was important. It was a trap of logic and theater. They had dressed their fury in wounded language and expected me to kneel and sew the hem of normalcy. For decades, I had complied. The Hollis family had an economy. I supplied logistics. They supplied applause. To break that economy felt like theft. David looked at me with the kind of disappointment reserved for a child who had brought home a C when the family had always been A+. We gave you what you needed. The tools. The trust, he said. You promised. You gave me circuits and called it gratitude, I said, and the room inhaled. It was the first honest sentence to cross their threshold in years. You left Ava without a launch, my mother said, as if the world were a stage and harm had a single punishable name. Yes, I said, I did. Silence gathered like a storm cloud. I had expected arguments. What followed was a cascade of accusations. How I was ungrateful, how I had sabotaged the family name, how I had made Ava a spectacle of failure. They assumed the world would collapse into spite because one person refused to be the backstage. I took a breath. I counted the beats as if marking a drum. I had rehearsed nothing. I had practiced not being this person. In truth, I had practiced being sharper in small moments, but never like this. You asked me to organize launches, weddings, showers, graduations, I said. For years. I did. I did it right. I made sure every tablecloth matched, every timeline held, every mother looked like she had been handed perfection. I put deposits on my card, rearranged my life, canceled plans, wiped tears that weren't mine. I did it because I believed that loyalty was repayment. I believed my work earned me a place in this family that didn't involve being a resource. My father's jaw clenched. Ava's eyes flashed with hurt. She had the look of someone who had been raised to assume that the spotlight was owed. You knew, my mother said, lowering her voice. You knew what you were doing. No, I said. I didn't know that I could be anything else. They all blinked at me like I'd recited something foreign. My words were not theatrical. They were exhausted. I pulled a folder from my shelf, my own folder, the one labeled My Birthday. I opened it. There were receipts, pictures, a paper with dates. The birthdays I had missed, the dinners canceled. I showed them a calendar from the last 7 years, highlighted in neat ink, each birthday that had been rescheduled and then never honored. I read the entries to them. I told them about the lavender soap, the voucher for bedsheets. I told them about the time my 27th birthday had been made invisible because I had ordered flowers for my cousin's rehearsal. Their faces, David, Susan, Ava, shifted in ways that were small, a twitch like a curtain. You made me into a function, I said. I did not ask to be unpaid labor. I am not a calendar service. There was yelling. There were accusations about selfishness. There were ugly words that my mother had never used in front of anyone else. Words that were about the economy of attention. My neighbor Marcus later told me that from below, the conversation sounded like knives. They wanted a clean answer. They wanted to know whether I would return the deposits, whether I would fix the event, whether I would be the person they'd always known. I told them the truth. I would not be their default anymore. You're making a big mistake, David said, which is the sentence people use when the only thing they can offer is power. I'm making the only choice I have, I said. Either I let this pattern continue, or I change it. I told them that I had kept a ledger, years and years of invisible labor, and that I was not going to be shamed for claiming my account. I suggested a number, one that wasn't punitive but acknowledged my time. They bristled as if I had handed them a check with an insulting figure, but the math was simple. Hours logged, mental bandwidth taxed, expenses fronted. The family economy had been built on my quiet giving. I was asking for fairness. My mother began to cry. The first authentic thing I had seen from her in a decade. We never meant to hurt you, she said. We didn't know you felt this way. You didn't ask, I said. You assumed. They tried apologies. They tried bargaining. If you help us now, we'll do better. The words were like band-aids over a wound that needed sutures. It was not that I wanted to hurt them. It was that I had to choose myself. I had to build new grooves for how we operated. You can't just, Ava began. Yes, I said. interrupting for the first time with the firm, clean edge I had been cultivating on long walks and in therapy sessions I had barely started. I can. I will. That night, I slept with the window cracked. The house sounded different. Doors closing, voices like small storms. I felt unrest and a deep, cool relief. I was not a martyr. I was a person whose life had been repeatedly on loan. The year that followed was small, and then, daily, it became enormous. I started therapy in earnest. I learned how to name what had been taken from me: attention, time, the right to plan my own rituals. I went to a financial advisor and stopped letting my bank account act like a favored child. I negotiated a raise at work. Unpardonable, I suppose, but necessary. My colleagues' eyes changed when I started saying no in ways that did not dismantle me. Sure, can you take that? Became, I can't take that right now, with a plan attached. The world did not collapse. My calendar had a new rhythm. My mother tried, awkwardly, haltingly, to make amends. She sent a card with my name written in a hand that was slightly less practiced in delegation. She called on my actual birthday 1 year later and said, I booked a small dinner, no fanfare. It was an offering, not a ledger. My father called to ask how I was, without asking me to fill a role. These were small, important things. Ava and I established boundaries that were clumsy at first. She learned to text rather than summon. I learned to answer when I felt like it rather than on command. She sent me a DM once with a photo of her new line, and it was a real vulnerability. No entitlement, just a proud person seeking a sister's smile. A year later, I hosted my own birthday party in the apartment I had made mine. The living room was modestly lit, small string lights and my grandmother's tea set on the coffee table. Photographs from Sedona lined the mantel. A sunrise, my profile against the red rock, Jess with the crooked banner. Lila baked a cake that tasted like honest sugar, not spectacle. Marcus brought a plant, a succulent in a chipped pot that I adored. Tomoko arranged a playlist that made everyone talk and also dance. I had invited the people who had shown up when it mattered. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. My mother came late, awkward in a dress that looked, to my relief, like it had been chosen by her own love rather than a stylist. She handed me a small late present, lavender soap and a note. For the times you take care of yourself. Her handwriting was uneven, as if nervous. You did this, she said, looking around. Yes, I said, my voice was steady. I did. We ate cake. We toasted with cheap champagne because I liked the way it popped. The room smelled like thrumming conversations and candles. I cut the cake and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and gravity. When I blew out the candle, I did not make a wish that involved approval or rescue. I made a quieter promise. To honor the times I chose myself. That year was not perfect. There were relapses into old roles, calls where my mother panicked and texted me to fix things, and I would feel the old reflex tug. But I had built a practice. I would say no, then offer one concrete way I could contribute that didn't require my whole life. They adjusted, slowly. People do. Ava and I still had arguments. She would occasionally text, "Remember who makes your cupcakes?" with a snarky emoji that stung. I would respond with boundaries. If you need logistics, hire someone. If you need emotional support, ask specifically. Don't assume. She sent an apology once. It was short. It said, "I'm sorry I assumed." It was not a confession. It was a small, honest stitch. A year after I had left for Sedona, I was home on a Wednesday evening when my mother knocked on my door. She stood there with the expression of someone who has rehearsed humility. In her hands, she held a small stack of envelopes and a trembling smile. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. Her voice was small in a way that suggested she no longer expected obedience. "What is it?" I asked. And I was curious because the woman who could order a chair polish with a flicker of an eye had altered in ways I'd seen in the last year. Her calls were less insistent, more like a neighbor asking for a cup of sugar. "We have a family dinner next month," she said. Can you help? The centerpiece. You always had a way." I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the outline of the woman who had raised me. Flawed, capable of love and of habit. It would have been easy to say no to be cruel, to savor the power of refusal like a newfound toy. But this was not about cruelty. It was about terms. "I will not be the default," I said, gentle but firm. "If I help, it will be on my terms. I will set the budget. I will be paid for my time. I will have notice in advance, and you will not assume I will rearrange my life for you." My mother's eyes filled. She nodded slowly, like someone taking a breath before swimming. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You can ask me," I said, "and then I'll choose." She reached across and took my hand for a second. Her palm was warm, not like an offer, but like a repair job. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being honest." That night I sat on my balcony, the city a scatter of lights, and I thought of the woman I had been, myself folded thin and useful. I thought of the year I had spent assembling the small, ordinary rebellions that had become structure. I had traded invisibility for clarity. I had traded being everyone's organizer for being my own. The cost had been messy and necessary, arguments and tears, a family scandal that leaked into dinner conversations and neighborhood gossip. But I had watched myself grow like a plant nursed in sun. There were days I missed the old role. People liked me when I could be their miracle worker. They noticed me in exactly the way I used to crave, for how I could make their lives easier. But there was a new thrill in being valued for a person who made a decision, who could say yes and no with the same currency. When I walked into a room now, my shoulders had a steadiness they used to borrow from other people. My work life changed in small, tangible ways. I asked for a promotion and got it. They listened when I said I needed better boundaries to avoid burnout. They listened because wherever I had worked, I had always been irreplaceable in the way that competent people are irreplaceable, but now they knew the cost of burning me out. I started a savings plan that felt like a small act of faith. I opened a retirement account, symbolic perhaps, but it felt like planting a tree. One evening, a little over a year after Sedona, my mother called. "We have a friend who's hosting a charity event," she said. "She's asking if you could help with the guest list." I could hear the old script starting to unfurl. "You're organized, you'll do it." My new habit was practiced resistance. I took a breath. "My calendar is full," I said, "but I can give you a 1-hour consult on how to structure the guest list next Tuesday at 6 p.m. I will bill you my hourly rate. If you want me to implement it, we'll arrange a contract." There was a pause, then. Could you please do it for less, for us?" I felt the old reflex, to shrink, to give cheap labor out of love, tug at me. I had choices, clear and bright like coins. I could say yes and fall back into the familiar groove, or I could hold the boundary. "No," I said gently. "I have my plans. I have things I am building." It was the same sentence I had uttered in a smaller, more combustion-filled room months ago, but now it was quieter, and it landed without shattering. My mother made a little sound like a sigh that wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a woman learning to ask differently. Years had taught me that the most radical acts are often small. The courage to say no had been my revolution. It had not been performed with slogans or posters. It had been a reassigning of weight and attention, an insistence that my life was as worthy of orchestration as anyone else's. I had invented rituals for myself. A Sunday morning hike with Jess, a monthly therapy appointment that I never missed, the Sedona photo on my mantle, proof that I had survived and chosen. Sometimes late at night, I would find my old folder with the napkin swatches and the client lists and touch its edges like a relic. I did not regret the work I had done for my family. It had been love folded into logistics. But love does not need self-effacement to be true. The trick I had had to learn, painfully, gratefully, was that generosity without reciprocity carved hollows into the giver. The antidote was insistence on wholeness. On my 32nd birthday, my mother showed up with a small bouquet and eyes that seemed younger. She gave me a card and inside wrote, "For learning to be seen, I am trying to learn too." Her handwriting wobbled at the edges in that honest way. I kept the card. I had every dish I loved on my table that night. We said small, messy things. Ava raised her glass and said, voice a shade more humbly than before, "To Maya, may you always have your own room at the table." People laughed. It was clumsy, but it was true. I thought of the year I had hidden and emerged. I thought of the phone messages I had ignored, and the way the Sedona sunrise had seemed to open a small cleft in my life where light could pour. I no longer organized only for others. I scheduled for myself, stamped my passport for that small rebellion, kept an account of my labor, and paid myself back with rest. There was a finality to it that was not punitive. I had not sought to exile my family from my life. I had sought to reweave it with threads that included me. The day I closed the door on the last argument, I felt neither triumph nor defeat. I felt, oddly, peace. I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to be important in your own story. Some nights, when the city was quiet and my apartment hummed with my plants, I would run my fingers over the Sedona photographs. I had framed the banner where my name hung. It made me smile, a small private joke at the audience who had once refused me the leading role. The revolution had been quiet, almost domestic. A canceled flight that had been a flight toward myself. A ledger turned into a boundary, a therapy appointment that had given me vocabulary for the silent injustices I had endured. I had not burned bridges so much as rebuilt them, wider, sturdier, with room for give and return. And when months later, my mother called with the old plea, "You're so organized, can you help?" I answered as I had in the small living room with the folder and the calendar. I loved them. Love now included my limits. Love now included my self-worth. I could still help. I would still bring my skill. But it would no longer be at the cost of myself. "No," I said gently. "I have my plans." I put the phone down and poured myself a cup of tea. It was lavender, the scent familiar and soothing. The steam fogged the glass for a second and then cleared. I looked at the Sedona photo on the mantel, at my name printed on a crooked handmade banner, and felt with an unexpected, quiet lucidity that I had learned how to be important to myself. The feeling was not loud like victory. It was the soft resonance of a bell that finally found its right tone. Sometimes the biggest party you ever throw is the one you host for yourself. A small room, a handful of faithful people, the sunrise painting your skin like a benediction. I had learned that being organized could be radical when it was organized around your own life. And now, when someone asked me to help, I took a breath, considered my calendar, and chose.